Hello and welcome to the final edition of Legislative Update for this year's legislative session in Montpelier. My name is Tom Ayres, Senior Staff Writer for the Vermont Standard newspaper in Woodstock. And this program has been produced each week this legislative session in collaboration with our friends at Okemo Valley TV. As always, my guest this week and every week is Representative Charlie Kimbell of Woodstock. We've been talking about education transformation for much of this session of the legislature, as well as the last session of the legislature. And on Friday evening of this past week, two committees of the House and Senate, in collaboration with the governor, hammered out an agreement on an education transformation bill, which was then passed yesterday, Monday, June 16th, by both houses of the legislature. And Charlie's here to talk about that whole process.
Good
Today.
morning. Good morning. Yes.
Welcome, Charlie, and thanks for joining us on such short notice after I hope you got a good night's sleep last evening following that marathon and somewhat contentious session yesterday. So let's talk a little bit about the bullet points of what's in the final version of the bill, and then what compromises did the two conference committees make with the governor that have enabled the governor to say he's able to sign the bill that was passed yesterday.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, largely the bill reflects everything we've talked about before with the establishment of different school districts that begins in 2026. The foundation formula that we've talked about extensively, which takes effect for the fiscal year of 2029. So one of the things that the conferees agreed to in order to meet the governor's needs was to have a shorter time frame by 1 year. That we had put it out to fiscal year 30, and the governor wanted to see some faster action than that. So that was one thing that the conferees agreed to, and we voted on. The second thing that we had talked about is how are these districts, the new districts, going to be formed? And the House originally, when it came out of the Committee on Education, had a proposal for 5 professionals that had been in the school system, the superintendents or retired superintendents or business managers. And then the bill was amended on the House floor to add 4 legislators to that, because it was viewed that the legislators are going to have to make the decision anyway. The Senate had a much different construct that they wanted only legislators to be on that committee, and they wanted 3 from the House and 3 from the Senate in that school district formation. And so what we ended up with was a compromise to keep the 5 professional members and then the 6 legislators, which were requested by the Senate, but also add some financial support for the Agency of Digital Services to provide additional mapping research for us that uses population bases and school facilities and everything else that they have access to in order to provide that committee with assistance. So that was another compromise. The other compromise was fairly large. Is the House had passed that, and the governor had supported a request that 51% of any, or for private schools, and the term is approved independent schools, that receive students from the public schools because they don't have an operating high school in their district. That 51% of this, in order to receive those funds, then 51% of the students in that school would have to be publicly funded. So it's really going to say we are only going to provide funds if the school has more than half of the students that are getting publicly funded. The Senate came back with a much different proposal. They said we want it to be limited to 25% of the Vermont students are publicly funded. And then we settled on 25% of all students. So it was slightly larger. And while we were not happy with this particular uh, compromise, it does reduce the amount of funds going to private schools and reduces it from, I think, about 50 schools now, it might be 70 private schools that receive public funding to about 20. And I can't be more exact than that because those are the best estimates that we have as to how many schools right now are receiving public dollars.
Hmm.
So those are some of the big broad strokes in there. The biggest stuff is what still has to happen. Uh, the recommendation for the new school districts is due in January of 2026. That's not that far away, really. And the legislature has to vote on them in the next session. Coming up with doing a study, that was also one of the compromises, doing a study to make sure that high school students do not cost more to educate than elementary students. So the contention of the Senate said, hey, it costs more to educate a high school student. And that is true in other parts of the country.
Hmm.
But the research that we had indicated there was no difference in cost between educating an elementary school student and a high school student. So we're going to have research come back to us with either one consultant or more consultants to either verify that it doesn't cost more or that it does cost more. And it
Hmm.
has a spending provision that enables some of those approved independent schools to charge more than what the base amount is, unless we can demonstrate that the cost is actually the same to educate a primary student and a secondary student.
Hmm.
So, I mean, and that's really to satisfy both the concern that the Senate had and also the assertion that the House had, and then to come to some kind of compromise in 2026.
Okay,
Um,
great.
so those are some of the broad strokes about what the compromise.
One thing I was curious about, Charlie, before we go on with the discussion of the Education Transformation Act, I noted that there was a roll call vote in the Senate, um, but the House was a voice vote. Um, and I'm just wondering if you can reflect on that a little bit. I don't know what Speaker Joe Krawinski's thinking was in that regard, but um, I did take note of that. Any thoughts on that, or is there any discussion on that among your colleagues?
There was some discussion about it for sure. It's really hard at the end of a session, especially on the last day after about 10 hours of being on and off and on and off. That oftentimes things happen and you afterwards you say, what just happened there? And that's sometimes procedural if you're not alert enough as you had been in the past and trying to pay attention to where are things. So it moved faster in the House in terms of getting to a vote. Um, and it was a voice vote, not a roll call vote, so people were not on the record. And then we did have a roll call vote on whether or not to pass it to the governor. So that was where the roll call vote actually happened. And that reflected how people felt about the bill. And while that was a procedural vote, the actual votes on that, I think, fairly reflect how members felt about it.
Okay.
So, so that happened. I mean, there are a couple of things that happened procedurally. One is that there are some things in the conference committee report that weren't originally passed by the House or the Senate, so it was new information.
Hmm.
So there was an objection to the inclusion of new information in the conference committee report. So we had to take a vote on that. I mean, the speaker found that it was a point well taken, which means that, yeah, we're not going to accept this unless we vote to suspend the rules and include the information from the conference committee. We took a vote on that. So there's a lot of procedural votes that have to happen during the day. And that vote happened, and that was, I think, 139 votes to say, yes, let's move forward with that. So
Hmm.
that's out of 139 members, 113 voted yes. So there was, I think, 11 people absent yesterday.
On the first procedural matter, I think it was, if I remember the numbers correctly, something like 96 to 45.
Yeah, and
Um,
that could have been, yeah,
about
yeah,
moving it forward to the governor. That was
yeah,
uh,
yeah. That sounds about right.
Representative Vyhovsky's motion from Chittenden County. Um,
So
I'm going to try and access those roll call numbers. I was able to find them for the Senate fairly quickly, but I couldn't find them for the House, but I'll attempt to access those just to see how our legislators voted. I know that in the Senate, all three of the Windsor County senators voted against the package. So,
Yeah, they did. And I had
yeah,
conversations with at least one of the senators previous to the vote. And that senator indicated objections to the bill. Some of the things that, while I disagree, understood where the senator was coming from. I mean, I think
yeah,
I was one of the only local representatives voting in favor of the bill. And I did so because of some primary provisions. One, it creates a state aid for school construction program, which hasn't been in existence since 2008. And that will help schools actually rebuild, especially if we're talking about reconfigured school districts. Where are we going to put regional high schools? Do we need a new facility? We certainly need a new facility in Woodstock. So we need additional help because the bond vote didn't pass. So that's one reason. The second reason is that this bill creates more tax stability over time. And it gives the state the ability to charge different rates for primary homes versus second homes. And that's long been or the same rate. Right now, many of our towns have upside down tax rates, so that
mhm,
the primary homeowners pay more than the second homeowners, and that just does not set well with most local voters.
mhm,
Um, so those are some of the things, and also achieves some scale for things where you could achieve either better or improved cost efficiencies and quality at a larger scale. Some of those are around financial areas, but some are things like special education or professional development for your teaching staff. So there are some things that we can do with a bigger school district that we can't with a smaller school district. So there's some of that stuff too.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Um, Let me ask two questions here. The first question is, and you touched on this a little bit, but I just, for the purpose of our viewers, I just want to make sure we have clarity on this. We're talking about this transformation process and the whole funding strategy underpinning it, um, kicking in the fiscal year 2028.
Yeah, I'm hesitating because there's timelines for everything. Yeah, yeah,
Right, right. I just want
yeah.
to make sure. What is the timeline in the interim for providing property tax relief, which is a central um, objective of this process, between now and fiscal 2028? What mechanisms are in place or are contemplated for addressing the property tax issue over the next 3 years, or two to 3 years?
Yeah, so the school budgets are all set for the 2026 fiscal year. So starting on July 1st of this year and going to June 30th of next year. Those are already set, and the tax bill is already approved by the legislature and signed by the governor. So the tax rates are already set, and I think it's a 1.1% increase average across the state. And a lot of the communities in the Mountain View School District will actually have tax decreases uh,
Mm,
for this coming fiscal year. So that's the first part. The way to achieve that was to use one-time funds that has been done occasionally by the governor and the legislature. So $77 million in general funds and another $41 million in surplus funds from the education fund were used this year to buy down that tax rate or lower the amount to be raised by taxes. So that puts us a little behind the eight ball with saying, if we don't do that again next year, then the taxes are going to go up, because you don't have that $128 million or $118 million. So that puts pressure on the legislature to find $118 million at least, so as to keep the tax rates the same. The other part is, what are we doing on expenses? We just passed some legislation that should have an effect of lowering healthcare costs. And some of that is through regulation, and some of it is achieved some like reference-based pricing for different procedures. So that could help reduce overall healthcare costs. That is also a driver among our education fund when we're talking about that in our school system.
Hmm.
So to try to restrain those costs, and school boards have already made incredibly difficult decisions with either cutting programs or cutting staff or level funding things, and that
Hmm.
has not been easy. It's been very contentious, and nobody's making light of that or saying it won't happen, or it didn't happen without great pain and suffering because it's hard.
Hmm.
Um, so as to, but to continue to be diligent on the expense side. Um, so it's a bridge, really trying to create a bridge to get from now until when the foundation formula takes effect.
Speaking about the act, the Education Transformation Act, and this dovetails with what you just said, um, from a purely local perspective, the Mountain View's Supervisory Union School Board called an emergency meeting over the weekend. They held it on Sunday. Um, Sunday evening, if I am correct. And it was in direct response to the compromise legislation that was hammered out on Friday. Um, they voiced serious concern about that compromise legislation and uh, urged the community to reach out to legislators to um, urge them to vote no on the package yesterday. Simultaneously, although she did not issue a call for a no vote, Superintendent Sherry Souza of MVSU issued a letter to the community outlining a broad swath of concerns about the legislation for people to think about and be aware of. Um, can you respond to what some of the negative local impacts are specifically for MVSU schools and
Hmm.
just address some of those concerns that have been raised? I know the loss of local control, for example, is a central issue for rural communities in the state, and it does underpin the MVSU concerns. But I wonder if you can just address those concerns a little bit.
Well, yeah, the school board did have an emergency meeting that activated a lot of online templates to send to legislators as well. So I
Mhm.
think I received probably 150 emails in the course between Sunday night and Monday
Wow.
morning, and tried to respond to all of them and try to provide some clarifying facts as well to the people that wrote to me. For instance, one of the assertions was that this is doing more to favor private schools, and that it was private schools were not subject to the same class size minimums as public schools would be, and that's just not true. And so I wrote to those people that responded saying that that's not happening. There's concern about how much money was going to come to Mountain View School District in particular, and one of the spreadsheets that the Senate had asked the Joint Fiscal Office to run was, if you ran the foundation formula for the existing school districts, what would the impact be on those school districts? And that showed that the Mountain View School District would have a decrease of approximately $6 million from current
Mhm.
levels of funding. So there's a couple of things that are wrong with that. One is that we don't know what the next school district size is going to be. So it's comparing apples to oranges, and so it's not going to be exactly that. There could be cost efficiencies that are realized with a larger school district that wouldn't be realized at the local level. Second is that there's a lot to happen between now and then as to when it goes into effect, which is fiscal year 29, such as what's going on with career and technical education centers, how are we paying for that? A lot with what's been a big cost driver, special education administration and extraordinary expenses. And that's an actual term, extraordinary expenses that are above and beyond normal special education expenses. When it gets over a certain dollar limit, then the state picks it up, but you have to spend an incredible amount of money in a school district in order to get there.
Mhm.
So those are just two of the things that are in their pre-kindergarten and kindergarten. So there's a study on how are we delivering those, at what costs, and that type of thing. So there's a lot that's going to happen before that foundation formula takes effect, whether it's the school district size or these other elements that are part of it. So that's, and there's a great fear of what that does. I mean, the class size minimums, in terms of, will that force a small rural school to have to close? You know, the class size minimum for first grade is 10. For second through fifth grade, it's 12. And then you can combine classrooms between two different grades, but no more than two, and it has to meet that class size. And it gives a window as to how you evaluate that. I think it's 3 years in the bill, and it was originally 2 years. So there's a lot of escape valves throughout this entire legislative process. But the part about local control is interesting, always interesting, when you're talking about how somebody else's school budget that's passed in a different community is going to actually affect your school budget.
Mm-hmm.
And how your tax rate, I would say, not your school budget, but your tax rate, because it's the overall spending across the state that happens that affects what your tax rate is going to be, not just what you're spending on your local school.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of local control over the budgetary process is a little murky. It's been
Mm-hmm.
murky since 1997 when Act 60 came in. So it's actually, with a foundation formula, it's a lot easier for that school district to manage against as to how much am I getting in and how can I then decide as a school board and as a school administrator how I'm going to spend that money.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot more predictable in that sense. And it's the, the local voters, and we've talked about this before, in terms of, are the local voters going to have an opportunity to vote on their local school budget? And in the foundation formula, they do not. However, if you want to spend more than your foundation formula, then you can. Um, but it's limited 10% the first year, then it goes down to 5% over what you receive in the foundation formula.
Mm-hmm.
So this local school district, not just your school, but the school district will have an opportunity to vote on that. So if you want to spend more than that, and that is in other states, and it exists that way. But so I hear the concerns and they're real, and I know that for myself and our other representatives, it's going to take a lot of work between now and next 3 years of working together to figure out, or what does this one actually mean now? What does the school district look like? What's the relationship with other existing school districts that are all brought in underneath one envelope? What is the amount of money coming in? How does that affect what's going on? What about the transportation budget? How long are Johnny and Susie going to be on a bus
Mm-hmm.
coming to school? That's a frequent concern.
Sure, sure.
And so there is a lot of born out of a lack of definitive information right now, and I get that. So because
Mm-hmm.
it's not certain, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, and there's been previous experience people have with Act 46, which was extremely painful, and they're not sure the outcomes were great.
Mm-hmm.
So it caused a lot of consternation in and amongst communities, and people are saying, "Well, what happened?" And some of the achievements from Act 46 got lost, and some of the money that was saved got spent. So those are kind of what happened. So we have
Mm-hmm.
to be a lot more diligent with what's going to happen with this bill.
Absolutely. So you have the consolidation component of the bill,
Yep.
and then you referenced earlier that there is a school construction component to it as well. Can you talk a little bit more about that school construction component? And then, given those two things, and given the rejection of the bond issue last year by the voters in the MVSU district, um, is it reasonable to expect that any consideration of a new Woodstock Union High School and middle school is off the table until fiscal 28?
I don't know. There's no prohibition about against new school construction right now. There's a question about, are you eligible for school or state aid for school construction? And I try to ferret out as to, does the state currently have a way for school projects to get approved by the Agency of Education? And Woodstock, when it went through its Woodstock Union High School with this new school had received approval from the state, from the Agency of Education, but that was only in terms of these expenses appear to be reasonable and that it would not apply to the excess spending threshold
Mm-hmm.
when that was a thing. So the excess spending threshold with this goes, okay, there's nothing prohibiting a new school from being constructed. Now I know that there's conversations that are going on with other regional high schools or other high schools in the region, I should say, about what the future looks like. Hartford is now beset by PCB issues. And so it's got some real challenges. How many kids are in our school? How many kids are in their school? How many kids are in Windsor? I don't know.
Right. Right.
So, looking at those opportunities, I think are things that are being embraced right now by
Mhm.
some of our local board members. And I don't know how live those discussions are, but that's stuff that can occur and should occur, and to be proactive about how can we, as a region, more effectively organize. It does at some point have to fold into all the other things that are going on with this bill, and talking about regionalization or talking about those new school districts. How does that fit in? So if you really wanted to be cautious, you'd wait
Right.
to figure out what the prioritized projects are. Is there public money coming in? I tried to see if there was legislation to put in that said any project that was conceived of prior to the creation of the school districts and already approved by the State Board of Education or the Agency of Education, that they would be eligible for state aid. To
Mm-hmm.
see if there was some provision to get that in the bill.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't possible. Would it be possible in this next legislative session? Maybe. So I'm still going to keep trying to see if there's a way to craft that and get
Mm-hmm.
that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Is there anything that I have not touched on that you want to say about the whole process and the end result, that I haven't quizzed you on?
Let's say one of the complaints or one of the issues that people have said is you're rushing this.
Mm-hmm.
You're
Mm-hmm.
going too fast. This is, once in a lifetime generational change. Don't force this. People didn't ask for this. They asked for lower property taxes. And I'd have to come back with a couple of things. One is that we created a commission on the future of public education last year. And one of their first responsibilities was to come back in December of last year and make recommendations as to how to immediately reduce costs. They came back in December after thorough evaluation and came back and said, we're not ready to recommend anything. If they had, we probably wouldn't be in this position now. Because what they said is that it's really complex. You can't affect costs without affecting delivery, without affecting governance, and all the things that we're talking about in this bill. So they're right, and they're also wrong. So it would have been a lot easier had they found something that was this, magic pot of beans to say, this is how you're going to reduce your expenses.
Mm-hmm.
It's really wholesale looking at everything. The
Mm.
second piece is that we heard from hundreds of people, both on the education policy side and also on the tax side, people that are in the field, educators, national professionals, on education finance, on policy, and people also locally about how this could all work. Active engagement with Vermont School Boards Association, Vermont Superintendents Association, the teachers, the NEA, and extensive involvement and discussion all along the way over the past 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
So it was not rushed. There is an opportunity and a necessity over the next year or two to continue to work on these things with decisions that have to be made. So
Mm-hmm.
we're not done. I would say this is the first step in a multi-step process about how do you really achieve education transformation in the state to guarantee that kids in every pocket of the state have equal opportunities, get a stable financial funding source that's sustainable, um, and have something we can all be proud of as a way to attract and retain parents and families in Vermont.
Excellent, excellent. That's a great summation. One final question. Um, the the committee, the study group, however you want to characterize it, that has been formed to look at consolidation consisting of a mix of legislators and either retired or current educational administrators,
Yeah.
superintendents, and so on. Does the legislation provide any kind of target number for the number of consolidated districts that there will be statewide, or is that up to that study group to determine?
It's up to the study group. So there's nothing in the legislation. No, we did put in a target of, from a practical standpoint, school districts should have approximately 4,000 to 8,000 students.
Okay.
That was also something that was objected to, and a few people saying it's way too big. But it's obviously going to be different in different areas, because it'd be nearly impossible to hit those numbers when a small geographic area in the Northeast Kingdom or in central Vermont.
Absolutely.
Pretty easy to hit those numbers up in Burlington or the Northwest corner. But for us, yeah, almost impossible. So it's, yeah, how do we achieve that number?
Mm-hmm.
So no, there's no, one of the original proposals from the governor was 5 districts across the state. And I think the smallest district was about 10,000 students. We're not talking about that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, if you just take the number of students, 8,300, and divide by 8,000, that'd be 10 districts. Again, too small, too few. And if you take it and divide it by 4,000 students, you know, 20 districts. So somewhere between 10 and 20 is probably where we end
Mm-hmm.
up. Um, but there's no one saying it's going to be 12, it's got to be 17, it's got to be 19, nothing like that. And
Mm-hmm.
to give that committee a lot of a lot of leeway in the sense of drawing up what those districts or supervisory unions. That was a concept the Senate really wanted to feel strongly about. And so that has yet to be decided, and they're going to start soon. I mean, I think next month is when the
Wow.
people have to be appointed to really get their work done by the end of the year.
Has the legislature determined who its representatives will be to that committee, or is that to be determined as well?
I haven't heard anything, so I'm sure the speaker is already working on the 3 that the speaker would recommend, and the committee on committees, I'm sure, is working on which members they'd recommend.
Mm-hmm.
So don't know yet.
Okay, great. Well, Representative Charlie Kimbell, it's been really enlightening to have you with us each week, particularly during this session to talk about this extraordinarily important but complicated issue. Um, Clearly, the discussions will continue, as you've indicated, in the next session of the legislature and beyond, beginning in 2026. Um, I want to thank you for all the time you've devoted to this program over the last 3 months,
Thank you,
and
Tom
um,
and
and
Patrick.
we will see you again in the fall, I'm sure.
Terrific. All right.
All right, take care and thank you. This is Tom Ayres signing off for this edition of Legislative Update, the final edition of this 2025 legislative session in Montpelier, and we'll return in the fall with Legislative Update once again for the Vermont Standard and Okemo Valley TV, signing off until September. Take care.